think highlighting your podcast is one of the things that I'm interested in, because you've put it together, a couple years ago, more than 2 years, something like that.
June 2020. So in a couple months will be 2 years.
Oh, okay, perfect. And you call it the philosophy of art and science.
That's right. And
It's
that's
basically
the
a
second
university, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? Like, why that title?
I just had to pick a title, and my trouble is I want to always change it. I'm very iterative. I think maybe coinciding with the iterative movement in software development, but not aware of it. I've always been someone who gets feedback from leadership and gets feedback from consumers, but also has my own crazy ideas that I always want a new name. So for example, the name of my Patreon, it used to be Tawahado, patreon.com/Tawahado, because my first ever podcast launched in 2016, and it was the Tawahado Bible Study, focused exclusively on Bible study, and you were a guest on that show. But when I did this new podcast, which launched in 2020, I wanted something that was generic enough to allow me to do whatever I want, because I have multiple interests and I'm multifaceted. But at the same time, I wanted it to represent what I thought was a fundamental part of me, which for me is critical thinking. You know, it goes back to Socrates. As much as I've strayed from Western philosophy, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's his famous statement. I take it very seriously. So I try to think critically about it, and what I think by it, I mean everything. And so by that, I take the whole humanities and STEM, maybe neglecting social science, but all of humanities and STEM, summating it with art and science, because one of my favorite classes as an undergraduate was philosophy of art or philosophy of aesthetics. But I think the philosophy of science is a great discipline. I know a little bit less about the philosophy of science, but I'm definitely interested in figures like who are in that field and who have, you know, tested the bounds of knowledge there.
Yeah,
so it's critical thinking about everything. And I would say most people end up hating you if you critically think about, like, you know, what flavor ice cream you should have. But I think that there's some value in like not turning it off. I also can't turn it off.
Yeah, and what I like about, you know, your explanation too is that philosophy is it's an antecedent discipline. It's an early discipline that yields things like art, that yields things like the sciences. And you know, one thing that not just students but folks at large, I think they tend to misperceive is, you know, in the university system, you can take a philosophy class, you can take an art class, you can take different science classes. And so it's almost as though philosophy has been paired as a subject against these other ways of thinking, when really you need philosophy as a core set of, you know, I mean, like you said, it's a question of human thought. How do we think about things? How do we reason things? How do we, you know, use our intellect to then go into new fields, new domains? How do we produce art? How do we innovate, right, through that reasoning? And there's interesting stuff in the sciences. So I like your take on it. I like, you know, when I think of your podcast, I'm like, this guy he's preserving Ethiopian culture. For those of you listening, Henok is Ethiopian, and you're preserving Ethiopian culture in an inverted way, right? Like it's not about Ethiopia. It's an Ethiopian, you know, intellectual having conversations that aren't bound necessarily by one theme, or like the Tawahido, the oneness, or, you know, this is a term used for the Ethiopian Christian tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahido Church. If you call it that, well, it's probably going to be a Bible study, or it's probably going to be something religious. If you know, you make it broader, you have that.
Which is why I replaced it with Aksum on a lot of things. The Substack is Aksum.substack. The Gumroad is Aksum.gumroad. The Patreon has, you know, /Aksum. and I thought that encompasses it more because it is a reference to the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia. At the same time, it leaves room because all these platforms are new technology. Gumroad, Patreon, and Substack are all these new technologies. So there's a blending of the Afro-Asiatic past and its future. Because you're a language guy, I get to go into it a little bit as well. Philosophia is the love of wisdom. And one of the claims that, my Hebrew teacher would say, and I would agree in regards to the Bible, is that it takes, if you have the Septuagint, Sophia, wisdom of the Older Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and then you have the Hebrew, which I think is the same in Arabic and other language, the Hakmanna, which is, it reinterprets that Platonic school or the pre-Platonic schools of wisdom loving, and says, well, this is another way to show the love of wisdom. And like you said, it's something that some Christian rappers have said. They said, like Lecrae, he says, I'm not a Christian rapper, I'm a rapper who happens to be Christian. And so my podcast is not necessarily an Aksumite podcast, because there's a lot of stuff about America on there, and LA, where I'm from, born and raised. So it's a podcast run by someone who's very authentically and unapologetically Aksumite.
I love that. I love it. And as far as Chokhmah, the idea of wisdom and how it contrasts with philosophy or philosophia, there's an interesting problem that happens in, I don't just want to call it academia, because it's not that. It's really in the Western intellectual tradition, where those things we call philosophy, we ascribe to the Greeks. And you know what? Rightfully so, because what we're talking about when we talk about Greek philosophy is their approach to it. And so then the question is, well, how do these other cultures that, they live, they exist, they thrive, and antedate the Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, what do we call their tradition? Is it philosophy because it's the love of wisdom? Like you say, we have the Old Testament has a book, or a couple books on it, and on that very topic. And I think, I don't know if you've ever met one of my colleagues, Dr. Gergis, but in his research he looks at pre-Christian Egyptian thought and how it impacts Coptic thinking. And so the question is, well, what do we call it? Do we call it Egyptian philosophy? And so I think the term he settled on was the Egyptian Sophia. In other words, it's leaning on that it is philosophy, but we can also still have that word the way it's used popularly in English language literature, at least. And well, how does it apply though to the way in which these people, who the Greeks themselves credit for many of their intellectual traditions, especially things like medicine, like they always go back to medicine and architecture and say, look to Egypt, or they'll send people to Egypt, and it's from Egypt that they learned, right? In that Mouseion, of Alexandria, and which inherits the pre-Alexander, ancient Egyptian tradition. So it's a cool question, I think. And the way your podcast proceeds, as it's someone belonging to Aksum, into that That's heritage. Right. I totally relate. Like I'm talking about my research like all the time, because it's my living, it's my job. And well, what else am I going to talk about? Hey, I know in your off time, why don't you talk about your research some more? And it's like, come on, take a break, bro. Like talk about things that are of interest to you. And I think what's nice about yours, what I really like and relate to, I may not be Ethiopian myself, but technically not, but I have a strong.
Depends on what time frame we're talking about. The biologist Brett Weinstein has been caught a couple times saying, "I'm just a less recent African migrant."
That's true. The closest that the DNA has been traced is the Mediterranean, and Greece and Italy are the I suppose geographically the closest, but yeah, in time. But culturally, like I feel very connected and at home among Ethiopians, and it's I don't know how other people take it. Like when I visit the communities, the churches, whomever I'm visiting, is so familiar to me, and that's not even at the language level, right? Language, like I can charm Ethiopian people because of my knowledge of things like Ethiopic Ge'ez, but I don't speak any of the modern, and I barely know any Ge'ez. I studied it for a very short time, and it's collected dust on the shelf. But we're going to fix that, you and me, in the short term. But it's such a cool culture, and not just it's a cool culture because it's maybe an Uber culture over. You would have a better number than this. What, 40 or so subcultures, and those in a, well, maybe not harmony, but in a collection, they form and maybe define Ethiopia. Am I right on that, or is it
Yeah,
a little more nuanced?
The regime that was in power from 1991 to 2018, and then you could say arguably waning power from 2018 till now, had a fundamental philosophy, to use that word again, of accentuating the differences of people rather than what unites them. And so they would claim that each language, if it could be considered a distinct language, and some of these languages really are dialects of each other. But that's another argument, for another day. But speaking loosely, considering them all independent languages, have 87 languages. So they would argue that there are, 87 cultures. For me, if you look at fundamentally genetics and culture, really we're talking about 4 to 6 main cultures, and it definitely is an amalgamation or a hodgepodge. But even within those, really it's about historic Ethiopia is the two to three main cultures of the Amhara and the Tigre, the Tigrinya speakers of Eritrea, and then you can say to an extent the people of Harar and Guraginya. Those are, and you include the Afar, who've always been there, and the Somali, and those orbits make up like the whole Horn of Africa. But like the Ethiopian nation state and the main identity is really the Amharic and the Tigrinya speakers for the most part, overwhelmingly.
And what's fascinating that a lot of people may not realize is just the ancientness of Ethiopia as a civilization, or civilization is the word. Some people don't like that today, but that's okay. We'll use it. And what we mean by that is things like monumental architecture, and especially writing history, its relations with other major powers. And, it's mentioned in scripture, right? I mean, like if it's mentioned in the Solomonic era, that's at least 900 years or more before, the common era, or before the incarnation, before Jesus, right? And so that's a long time to be present, or visually present, and to be able to measure that over time. And, they're, unlike a lot of places in Africa, every place in the world has an ancient heritage, obviously, but, what can you measure? And I think the measurables here is basically the architecture and text, monuments and inscriptions, later manuscripts, and the age of the language itself. We call it Ethiopic, and who knows how many languages were active at the time that it was, ancient Aksum, right? I mean, we have the Ezana stone, which records 3 languages, Ethiopic, Greek, and I think it's Old South Arabic is the other one, if I'm not mistaken. So it's
That's right. And in the port city of Adulis, which is about 30-40 kilometers southeast on the coast in modern day Eritrea of the Mouseion, sometimes called Massawa because of the Italians and the Turks, I imagine. But around there's an ancient port site, and people have done work on that, the throne of Adulis. Interestingly, it's in the Common Era, AD something, I think 200 and 300, around there, from 100 to 300. And all the stuff they found there is just in Greek so far. But yeah, more inland, they have the three languages going back to, I think, 800 BC.
It's definitely a unique place, and I think Ethiopia is not just unique for the world, but for Africa, and thus by extension for Africans, right? And if you were to think about, or if you would summarize the uniqueness of Ethiopia, how would you phrase it?
Yeah, my thinking changed on this ever since I've done the podcast and learned more and more. And you and I have talked about this in a sense off camera before. The literacy, I think, is number one. In the consciousness of the people, I think it's the never having been conquered by a European power. Whereas, by the scramble in Africa in the 1800s, and even some of the early 1900s, especially after the maps changed with the world wars, and then the independence movements that came later, Ethiopia was on the brink of civilizational collapse multiple times, maybe 3 to 5 times, depending on how we count it. The first time around the 900s AD with an alleged Yodit Gudit, who's either Jewish or pagan. Then again with Guraginya Muhammad, who is an Adalite, either Somali or Harari. I lean towards being Harari, which may mean that he's a former Aksumite. Yodit herself also might be a former Axumite. And he's backed by the Turks and the Yemenis, and it's an alliance of the Somalis and the people of Harar. Then, on the other side, you have Ethiopia and the Portuguese. Then again, the 2 attempts by the Italians. And then you could talk about what I would consider the 5th attempt, which is if you see what the British did when they came in and Emperor Theodore or Theodros died. So the story goes that he took his own life, but some more conspiratorial say maybe the British did it, but to save face and get out of the country safely, because they did so. They got into the country with the permission of other local Ethiopian dukes, so that, it's internal power politics. You could say that Britain and America are the ones that slowly unraveled the Ethiopian civilization with the communist revolution in 1974, because that, what happened roughly 50 years ago, was the biggest change in Ethiopian history of all time. And then, we had federal democracy in the early 90s, but that itself was built upon the communist revolution of 1974, which upended the civilization totally, where the only vestige left of old Ethiopia, I would say, is the cuisine and the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church is really the one that keeps it. But beginning in the 1930s and 50s, the Brits and the Americans, and maybe the French to an extent, influenced Ethiopia to abandon its Futanagast. Our friend Dr. David Spielman recently minted a PhD, does scholarship on the Futanagast, or the justice or the law of kings, which was the indigenous form of governance for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that was supplanted by Western constitutions, which almost inevitably, leads to, from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, from constitutional monarchy to, hey, let's have a communist revolution. So that's about, depending on how you count it, 4 or 5 instances where Ethiopia almost had a civilizational collapse. And yet the things I think that stick out in the minds of people are literacy, the fact that we've had literacy so far back, as we've said, before the Common Era, to independence, depending on what we mean by independence, particularly today with all the reliance on foreign aid. I think that independence might ring a bit hollow, but people's idea of not an overt European colonization, but I would, in my mind, think that there was a covert colonization when the civilization was upended in 1974, and people in the Ethiopian elites have been trying to restore it ever since. And my podcast definitely, if it could do anything, is adding fuel to the fire on the restoration side, not to kind of, resurrect or summon something from the dead, but to do something that takes into consideration the wisdom of the past, but also the wisdom of the present and the future, and mixes those together. And the component I didn't know about before, I would say, are the genetics, because, what is an African? A lot of people look at the phenotypes of Ethiopians, and sometimes innocently, people will call us, one of the prettiest people on earth. One of the first things people say to me is, I love your women, I love your food, and it's fine on its face. But what that conversation has meant in the United States is people wondering whether or not they're less African or less Black, and then being confronted every year as the DNA is unraveled more and more, we're realizing that we are the mix of several different major events. I believe the most recent big event was during the Bronze Age collapse. I don't know from where. My 2 best guesses is somewhere on the outskirts or periphery of Assyria or Babylonia, or perhaps even, Crete or the Minoan civilization. And you and I have kind of joked back and forth about things like linear A on that island, the unknown, script and things like that. But those are, for example, Crete, that civilization, whether it was concurrent or not, we don't know. But at one point they have something that could be a Semitic script. And then at a later point, they have what becomes Greek via the Mycenaean civilization. In Aksum and Adulis, we have, as we mentioned, a Semitic script. And in fact, the Semitic script that writes 2 different languages. And then we have the Greek language as well. So I don't know, it could be a total coincidence, but those types of things make me wonder. And then 40,000, 50,000 years ago, we have another event that's so deep in prehistory we don't know about. But fundamentally, people were in Africa, they left Africa. Some of those people came back and mixed with the people that were still there. And that's us. Whereas the story I may have grown up with, and the simple story people would have thought without looking at genetics and other material, but especially genetics, I think, don't lie. Pottery could lie, or we could misinterpret pottery, but genetics, the better the science gets, that's something that we can trust more. The kind of view that people had without consulting genetics is our people have been in Africa all the time and they never left, ever. And that's just not true. And one of the things that in common parlance, like you'll see on Instagram and TikTok, why do Habesha babies have weak genetics? And what they mean by that, it's themselves talking about it. What they mean by that is they're expecting their child to look half Black, what a half Black person would look like. But then they end up seeing the child, and the child looks more like someone that would be a fourth or less.
Yeah.
And there's a reason there that they, I feel like it's on the tip of their tongue, but they don't want to say it, or they don't want to accept it.
That's a really interesting analysis. Especially tying it back to, we'll talk about the Minoan civilization and linear A. So what he's referring to, linear A and linear B are two scripts that were found on the island of Crete. Linear B has been decoded as, we could call it Proto-Greek. It might be Minoan Greek. Either way, it's Greek enough that we're able to decode it through Greek. And linear A, there's a lot of theories that go around about what it is. One theory, is it Semitic? Because like the different lists of things and the registry at the end ends kulu, right? Which kulu from, is it the same in Amharic as it is in Ge'ez?
In Amharic, the K becomes an H and we say hudlu.
Okay.
But yeah, my podcast, my Tawado Bible study used to open with which all three of those words are Semitic cognates. And the first word is kullu, all.
All are total, right? And so, in the sense of total, right? All together. And that's why people have wanted it to be Semitic, because it matches what may be in a Phoenician list of similar type. And so the question is it a different language that uses the same word when totaling lists, or is it a convention that was adopted from a Semitic language and it's really a different language altogether? I have a hunch on something that it is, but I want to learn that a little better before I either agree or disagree and can publish it.
Yeah, that's just me, shooting the thing online and guessing with it, because it's uncanny that those languages or those scripts are side by side in the Horn of Africa, but also there. In a sense, if you look just at the larger branches, the other thing that is more in your wheelhouse we look at is the way in which Sumerian and Akkadian interact with each other and share cuneiform. Is that right? I'm not butchering it too much.
Yeah, you said it. I mean, like basically the Sumerians developed writing and they used cuneiform, which is the impressions in mud. They look triangular, the different signs. And the Akkadian speakers adopted Sumerian writing system to articulate their own language. And sure, we'll talk about that on your podcast, though.
So there are other cases of Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic being kind of found in the same place. It doesn't mean that there's any sort of causal relationship there, but yeah, I just thought it was funny to think about, and who knows, what time will tell.
Well, what's interesting too is, and you mentioned people going and coming, like coming and going, right? This travel side of what it means to be Ethiopian. And Africa is a place that really, if you understand the geography of Africa, you can understand a lot of its history, why it developed over time the way it did, or why it didn't develop. We'll just say it developed differently rather than didn't develop. But, there's a lot of coastline, but are there a lot of ports? No, it doesn't look like there's a lot of real natural ports, the same way you might have in the Mediterranean world, for example. And but through the Red Sea in the Horn of Africa is a little different story. And so you do have like this connection to the Mediterranean. Now there's no canal, there's no Suez Canal at the time, but there is mobility, right? And we know of like the Red Sea run and these ways of connecting Europe to India. And the quickest way is via Ethiopia. You can do it over land, but think about how does geography impact someone's mobility? If you are physically closer, but you've got a large mountain range, or you've got, a lot of desert or area where you can't eat, you can't provide provisions, and so you have to pack up. There's a reason why the Silk Road kind of goes up and around a lot of places rather than directly. And you could go through, the rivers of Mesopotamia down to the Persian Gulf was one way of traveling to the east, to India and beyond. The other was the Red Sea. And so the nice thing about the Red Sea is it took less time to go from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea than it would the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, or connecting to the Persian Gulf that way. So there's a reason that there's Greek there. And then the question is, who's reading stuff and why? And we know that Ethiopia has this very strong connection to both Arabic and Aramaic culture, and probably Akkadian culture too. I mean, it's just unexplored, to what end that might be, the Akkadian or the Assyro-Babylonian culture, Mesopotamian culture, basically. So it's interesting that we don't have as many, Aramaic and Ethiopian inscriptions the way we would. Okay, well, there's Greek ones. Surprise. Maybe one of the reasons is because Ethiopic, we'll call that. So if anyone's listening, when we say Ethiopic and Ge'ez, we're meaning the same thing. That's the classical language of Ethiopia, the same way like ancient Greek or Latin may be a classical language for, the Western powers. But maybe there's enough intelligibility that you don't need to make an inscription because the people get it.
I have never thought of that. That's funny.
Why else? It's possible. It also is dependent upon literacy and who's going to read it. And so if the travel, maybe the other issue might be travel from the Middle East would be more permanent, whereas the Greek might be more temporary, right? I'm just riffing.
I'll give you a modern example that backs your case. So in the 20th century, as one example, before communist revolution, so still historic Ethiopia going on, the more and more I learn about it, it's fascinating. There's these people, the Gurage, from which we get the Kutful culture that the rest of Ethiopia has now adopted as its own culture, but its most authentic expression is still the Gurage. And they have a lot of origin stories if you ask them, or if you ask historians or archaeologists or whoever. One of the arguments is that they used to be in modern day Eritrea, but that was around the time of the fall, the first almost civilizational collapse. So you could think about it as expansion and contraction of the Aksumite Empire around the Yodit Gudit, so around 900 or 1000. And then these are Aksumites that got left in the south during the contraction period. And so they got assimilated with the other cultures that were around and then get reincorporated later as the empire re-expands. So whatever the truth of them, I would say if, one of the arguments is that the Amharic culture was the most dominant from 1270 to 1974. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you put it aside. It being the case, virtually all of the businesses, and it's become a stereotype, so you don't want to make it a stereotype. We're speaking in general tendencies.
Sure, yeah.
Virtually all of the businesses in the capital city and some of the other major cosmopolitan areas were controlled by the Gurage and the Tigrinya speaking Eritreans. Now, what you can say about that is that they're both speakers of another Semitic language. And for them to pick up Amharic is an almost trivial thing. Mm-hmm. I don't want to trivialize language learning, but it's an almost trivial thing. And they say that the Gurage occupied all of the smaller businesses and all of the mid-sized to larger ones were occupied by the Tigrinya speaking Eritreans. And the extent of it, I didn't understand until very recently. Even today, one of the largest bakeries in Addis Ababa is called Shawa Bakery. And the thing that cracks me up about it is Shawa is an Amharic speaking region. So the name of it is an Amharic speaking region. The owner is a Tigrinya speaking Eritrean. Nice. And I just found out about that. My family married into that Eritrean family as well. So I learn and I hear these firsthand accounts from all these people. I have plenty of friends and my own family before I was married as well. And I would hear these stories, but like the older I get, the more I hear these stories. And you have to think, maybe there are many, many factors behind that. But one of them has to be your point that language acquisition and accessibility for some people is going to be easier than others. If you have Ge'ez, maybe you don't need Aramaic. You yourself, I've mentioned it on a couple of our podcasts, have called it the African Aramaic because Aramaic is not one language that you take and you curse Trump with, but it's a series of languages, right?
Yeah,
Of
right.
which Syriac is, I think, the big one that you work with, but there's also Biblical Aramaic and so many others.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question about like where does, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? And sometimes, the classical response is, well, a language has an army and a navy. So it means, what's the difference between Danish and Norwegian? Well, there's differences, but they're pretty intelligible. You go a little further to, Swedish, a little, more challenging. And look, I'm not a native of any of those languages, so I have no idea what I'm talking about. I just I've looked enough to know to say that, and that's it. But
I'll add to that too, because I used to be an ombudsman, which
there you
is
go.
it's a Nordic term.
Yeah.
It, I think originates in Norwegian, but it would be intelligible to all of them. And I practiced it on a Swedish friend about a year ago, and she knew what it was as immediately when I said it. It's supposed to be something equivalent to the representative of the people, or the voice of the people. And it's supposed to be this accountability mechanism that they created, almost like a alternative king, like not the king, but the one who takes in the complaints of the people and independently or objectively addresses it to the king or whoever the ruler is.
Like
and
the
they have it
viceroy,
across those cultures. Yeah.
or the Catholicos or something like that. Yeah, it's interesting too, just because, like you said, there's intelligibility and then there's difference. There's straight up difference. And, I think with Aramaic, it's, there are certain features about the language among the Semitic languages that if those features are present, you call it Aramaic. And it's when those features disappear, maybe you start calling it Arabic or Nabatean. Nabatean's like this gray zone between Aramaic and Arabic, right? And so maybe you call it Hebrew, or there's an inscription from a place called Der Allah, and it's been debated: is it Hebrew or is it Aramaic? And it's like in this geographical liminal zone between the two speech communities. And I would argue ultimately it's Aramaic. It's Aramaic, with this sort of scribal style, that may be more Canaanite. But in any case, I think it's interesting. I assume you're talking of the Guraginya or Guraginya speakers. How
Yes.
is it pretty different than Tigrinya? So Tigrinya is going to be more in the present day, country of Eritrea and maybe
Ethiopia.
Eastern Ethiopia, right?
Yeah.
Are they similar or distinct? We should ask Dr. Spielman.
Yeah, I think they're pretty distinct. He has found a number of interesting connections, even between Guraginya and Giz, and they're certainly there, but you have to dig to find them. It's very clear that the language, I've heard some people call it Tigre recently, but I always thought it was Tigre. But whatever it is, 30% of the population of Eritrea, about 1 million people, speak this one language called Tigre or Tigre, and that's the closest modern language to Giz, except those people are overwhelmingly Muslim, and so they'll use a lot of Arabic when they speak as opposed to using Giz when they speak, and they have almost no relationship with Giz, but their modern language is the closest. The second closest language to Giz of the modern languages is Tigrinya. After that would be Amharic or Amharic. And then you go into this kind of other branch of Ethiopian Semitic languages like Soddo and Guraginya and Argoba. Argoba, I don't think really has any more speakers, but there might be a few out there. And those languages are very similar to each other. Even the language of Harar, they call it Gesinan, which means the city language. And my father and his sister actually speak that because their neighbors spoke it in the capital city. But that language and Guraginya and Soddo and Argoba, I think, are closer. They kind of cluster together more to each other. And so there are definitely connections with Giz and with Amharic and Tigrinya and this other Tigre or Tigre, whatever the name of that language. Even the dialect language thing is tied up in politics. there's this dissertation on the Tigrinya language that comes out in 73 before the main revolution. And in that dissertation, it talks about 5 dialects of Tigrinya. 2 of them are in Ethiopia and 3 of them are in Eritrea. And then in addition, you have this other language that they call Tigre or Tigre. And even like writing these things out in English looks ridiculous, let alone writing them in Ge'ez. They're all like very similar. So that the Tigrinya speakers in Ethiopia, they're either called Tigre or Tagrawai. Now they made up a new term. In Eritrea, they're called Behera Tigrinya, which means the nation of Tigrinya speakers. And then the other group is called Tigre or Tigre. And you could hear even the designation itself is not necessarily a scientific designation. It's a category that people are coming up with, and they're very close to each other. But yeah, those cluster together well. Amharic is kind of by itself, but also related to those. And then there's the other set of Semitic languages.
It's really, fascinating. It goes back to what you said about the amount of cultures, maybe 3 to 4 sort of major communities, and then you have variations of that. And some maybe were more mobile, right? Some maybe were more movable, I guess.
And had less guns, like you said.
Yeah, and when you have
the Amharic stereotype is that they are the people with the guns.
What's adds, they are the official language, right? How many official languages are there in Ethiopia?
There's one official language, it's Amharic, but they've now added 4 working languages, which are Tigrinya, Afan Oromo or Orominya, and I believe Somali, and then maybe Afar. I think Afar might be after it. Guraginya, I used to think had way more prominence, but I don't think it's on the list. It's lower than that. And I think they did it by percentage of the population. So Somali is something like 6% of the population, which makes it somewhere between 6 and 8 million.
Is it written with the Ethiopic Fidel script, or is it written with Arabic script?
I think it's written with Latin script.
Latin?
Which is, it's crazy. Somali's been written with many different scripts over time. That's more of a nation building question. If anyone ever asks my opinion, they should all use the Ge'ez script. Whatever language we're using, we should have one script. It's crazy that some people through this regime, ethno-linguistic decentralization regime from 1991 to 2018 mainly, but whose influence is still being felt now because their policies have yet to be dismantled. The people have been dismantled or taken out of power, but their policies have not. You can be someone, for example, an Oromo speaker who grows up in an Oromo area, and you have your K-12 education in the Latin script, and that makes you virtually illiterate in the official language of the country that you're in. And you could imagine that on a large scale is only going to highlight and emphasize the differences between people in the regions versus in the capital city and in other parts of the country. And so it's a sort of, I believe, tactical and intentional thing that is meant to divide and conquer and ultimately Yugoslavize the country or Balkanize the country. So I don't think it's smart to have some of them in Latin script and some of them not. I don't even know, more about, the languages. I don't know is there an argument that the Latin script is better for a Cushitic language than a Semitic script would be? I don't know how that could be the case.
Well, the Ethiopian writing system, and I'm speaking more to the people who aren't you and me right now, who don't know this, but it's syllabic. So if it's not an alphabet, it's a chart, kind of like if anyone studied hiragana or katakana in Japanese, it's got consonant vowel, right? And that's the form. How would you, go through the halham?
The old system is ABGD order, abu, gi, da, he, wizo. The new system is ha, hu, he, ha, he, ho. So it even begins with alpha and ends with omega. It's seven sounds, 7 vowels. The new system puts the same consonant, and then you go through the 7 sounds of that consonant. The old system was scrambled in A, B, G, D order.
Interesting. And either way, you're hearing on the end the vowels on the end of the H. We'll just call it an H, right?
Yes, and the vowel order is the same in both. And in fact, in the 20th century, for example, mid 20th century, when my parents would learn it, as they are chanting the Psalms of David and First John and the Gospel of John in 3 different melodies in Ge'ez, the first thing they do is the new system of same consonant. Then they have to do the older system, which is scrambled consonant, same vowel. And then they have to go through these texts in order: First John, then Gospel of John, and then all the Psalms of David.
Man, slick. Well, just yeah, I like the traditional. I like pairing traditional learning methods with the different, techniques we use today. There's something to be said for the old style, even if it doesn't always jive with the learner, right? Now we're really, learner based or student based, in our teaching, and we try to, well, good teachers at least, we try to contextualize the material for the learning style of the specific student. Some professors or teachers don't do that, and it is what it is. So that's good for learning, one-on-one, or what being able to be accessible to each learner. But the traditional method should be, I think, if not equally valued, very much valued, because
it's brutal. It's brutal. I'll tell you that. I have a cousin. She's born and raised in the United States, like me, about 8 years older than me. And she says that she teaches the Ethiopic or Ge'ez alphabet or chart in 10 days. Now, I think that's crazy. One of the things she's told me, and I have a couple other friends who have similar rates, what they do is they just teach the first column, which is one sound. And then they assume that others could figure out the pattern on themselves. And she's a doctor in psychology, I believe, but it focuses on learning and memory. So she's very much applying new learning and memory techniques, and it's definitely student focused and all these things. The old system is brutal, by the way. Comes with a priest carrying like a tree branch, and if you don't say it right, you get smacked. Corporal punishment, very much alive back then. So it's brutal. My dad told me, his first teacher was absolutely abusive, so he left. And the way it was is like, you just literally go on the street and there's some guy just teaching on the street for free, and then like the people in that neighborhood kind of just give that guy food and alcohol. That's kind of his payment. And he maybe gets a salary or something from some other local parish. So my dad just went around the block and found like some other priest and ended up spending like 3 to 5 years. He doesn't even know how long it was, like learning that. So that's like our version of preschool and kindergarten before you enter grade school. And then he says that guy, he had a great relationship with him until he like graduated high school and left the country. Like that guy always checked up on him and everything, so wow. That system was definitely brutal. And God knows how many people didn't make it through the system. My mother went through most of the system, didn't finish, not because of any abusive priest or anything, but just didn't finish. And who knows like what their recidivism rates were in that system. But those who made it through those system, I would say, have the strongest Amharic.
Makes sense. And if we tie that to the question of, is the Ethiopic script the best suited for all languages in Ethiopia, I think there's a couple different ways of taking it. And your cousin's approach of teaching the first shape is useful in a way, because and I don't know this, I don't know the different, what each language sounds like. Are they all syllabically rhythmed the way Ge'ez or Amharic is? I would think maybe, but there could be some that are different language families that would sound radically different.
Over 90% are either Semitic or Cushitic. Mm-hmm. And I named basically the Semitic ones. The Cushitic ones are Afar, Somali, Ago, Oromo, Hadia, and a few others that I don't know off the top of my head. But I would say there 90+% of them are Afro-Asiatic. The ones that are not are, I think, Omotic or Nilotic, which is a very small percentage of the population, like less than 1%.
Yeah. So if the syllabic style of writing is well suited to those that it matches, that is obvious. Use that script. It's at least you can always transliterate into Latin. That's not Latin is probably one of the least problematic languages. Look at what happened to Turkish. It's gone through its own movement or Mongolian for that matter, right? Like another Altaic language where you have a specific Mongolian system derived from Aramaic, by the way, that gives way to several different scripts, and finally in the the 20th century is Cyrillic, like the Russian alphabet, and now we can write it in Latin. So it's easy, it's flexible. But if the language is not rhythmically syllabic, there is an alternative, and it's to use the older system that doesn't have the end marks or the nuance. So just to explain for those listening, there's a shape of every letter in the Ethiopic writing system, and the shape is manipulated ever so slightly, most of the time on the end, on the right side of the character, and it could be higher up, middle, or below. It could be a little nick, it could be a loop or something like this. And knowing those marks, in some cases it changes the entire shape of the letter, but most cases it's easier to tell if the little protrusion is in the middle, it's going to be one vowel. If it's at the bottom, it's going to be another vowel. And that's not so bad. But what does it come from, right? It comes from a static alphabet. And that static alphabet is like, it's related to Sabaic or epigraphic Old South Arabic. And it is a way of writing that doesn't have the vowel marks, which is very Semitic too. I mean, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, they're all traditionally written without vowel marks. They're consonantal, and then they're manipulated with dots or tenween or, some kind of notches, that go above or below what's written so that it can be vocalized with vowels. But most of the people, if you knew how to read it, you knew it, you were done. So if there are alphabets, if there are languages in Ethiopia that are not as easy to use with the syllabic system, that's okay. Use the base system, right? Because one of the rhythms, at least, is a constant. How would you say it? The one like t and t, right? There's one that's almost a pure consonant, or it's a consonant with a schwa or half vowel attached to it. And maybe that might be what that specific language in Ethiopia would use against, the other fully voweled out system. I don't know. I mean, or maybe it would just be heavy on those consonantal iterations rather than all the other vowel iterations. And it could just use the GETIS system itself and not necessarily need to just use the consonantal version.
Yeah, so. And each language has adapted it. In the transition from GETIS to Amharic, Amharic has added several letters that don't exist in GETIS. The ch sound didn't have it. The ch sound didn't have it. The j sound didn't have it. And Tigrinya has done those sounds plus another one, as in their capital city of Tigray right now. Is Amharic speakers call it Makale, Tigrinya speakers call it Makala. So they added this extra Q that's like deeper in the throat.
That's under Arabic influence. It might not be under Arabic influence, but like if you're listening to different people speak Arabic, you'll hear the accent where they will, in Arabic, it's a qaf. Maybe I'm using the Aramaic word for the letter, but
we have that. No, but we have that letter too. So that's ka, but then they have another one. It's deeper in there.
And so what happens with the qaf is that in certain regions you will just drop it and have a glottal stop, instead. So if you're ordering like, what would it be? It's not a hot pocket, not a pizza. It's called manaqish, but people don't say manaqish, they say manaish, where that Q transforms and disappears into this glottal stop. The Saudis Ethiopia, make it a G, but
I was just gonna say that. You got it. So some people turn Q's into G. So there's this thing with like, Mary Magdalene, Mariam Magdalawit. Some people say Magdalawit and some people say Magdalawit. And there's Magdala or Magdala. There are other cases of it too. But it's usually a GK shift. Tuesday was Magstasenyo, and most people now say Maksenyo. So it's usually a GK. So-and-so is Agale, which becomes Ikale. Like it's usually a GK thing, but sometimes it's a QG thing. So yeah, that they do that. And the Oromo speakers I've seen, they have some letter that I can't pronounce where it's halfway between a D and a J. And I've heard it so many times and I've tried to like say it. I can't say it, but they made a new letter of the script for those people who do it. You see, they use the Latin script now, but they used the script earlier. So in the early 20th century, there was this guy, Nasibu, who translated the Bible into Oromo, and he wrote it in the script. So it's not even that I'm like, reminiscing on something that never happened. Like it has already happened. It's, I think, just political things and a whole lot of missionaries, I think it was the influence. I think some people have said some German missionaries, and, it's easier for them to use a Latin script. Swedish missionaries, German missionaries, obviously the Italians, they all had their own influences when they came to Ethiopia.
Would that sound that you described sound anything like tse?
No, it's like j, but
okay.
I'm butchering it, but it's halfway between a D and a J. Like there's da and there's ja, and the ja doesn't exist in Ge'ez. The da is the original letter, which exists in Ge'ez. And then Amharic adds ja, Oromo adds ja. It's like when they transliterate it in the Latin script, they write DJ. But
it's an emphatic J. It's an emphatic J.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I was wondering because in Egypt, if you listen to the Arabic in Egypt, and this probably goes back to the way in which, maybe it was Alexandrian because there's no J in Greek, and Alexandria is a Greek colony there. So in northern Egypt, you'll pronounce the Arabic letter Jim, J, as Gim. They'll say Gamal, Gamal del Nasser, right? And if you you keep going up the Nile, which is south, in the middle it's Z, and then if you go further up the Nile, further south, it's J, and it becomes a real Jim again. So that's why I was wondering if, it sounds kind of like there's a D there, but maybe we call it an emphatic J.
On the same strain, on that same word and letter, the Tigrinya speakers pronounce it with a J, but the Amharic speakers with a G, and the G is what's there in the G's.
Yeah, God help us. We are nerds. This is unique, and if you're still listening, you're one of us. Just so you know, you are one of the 3 listeners. You are still one of us. Anyhow, I think the idea of mobility in Ethiopians has recently, not always, has recently been of interest to me because leaving Ethiopia and forming communities, you settle in different spots. LA is one of them, DC, right? Like Houston. There's Ethiopians in a lot of spots in the US. Are they mostly, Amharas, or are they from every region of Ethiopia? Like, how does that landscape?
They're from
LA?
most regions, but the more marginalized you are, the less likely you're going to be here. I would say, for example, one of the most marginalized groups are one of these Nilotic groups, one called the Anuak. And
Okay.
there's a gentleman, I think his name is Wada Wada. I apologize if I get it incorrect, but there's a small city called Austin, Minnesota, and he recently won political office there.
Huh.
Obala, I think it's Obala. I think his name is Obala, and he recently won office there. And for example, he is one of the more marginalized groups. There wouldn't be a ton of his group in Minnesota. I've heard that they've got quite a few of the Anuak there. I even have a friend, Dr. Richard Benton, who's a language guy, and he loves preserving these things. So he preserved like a little bit of Anuak from a speaker that he met. I think on SoundCloud, people could find it and listen to it. I had never heard it in my life,
Wow.
and there he is. He also has a bunch of Oromo friends that he learns Oromo from. He'll pick up a little Amharic and Giz from me. I know they have a strong Somali community out there in Minnesota too. So there are, I would say, Amhara, Tigray, Oromo, Gurage. These are like the big groups, but I haven't met that many people from Afar. In Minnesota, I met some Somali Ethiopians. In Los Angeles, I've never really met any Somali Ethiopians. That's not to say they're not here, but I don't see them as much. And there would be other, smaller groups too that you don't see as often. Certainly, I would say like the overwhelming amount of Eritreans that I've met are the Tigrinya speaking ones. There's a Saho tribe and an Afar tribe as well, and those are related in Eritrea. I don't really meet many people from there. The Tigre or the Tigre, whatever the name of the language is, I haven't met many people from there. I met some people who are mixed, but the smaller the group, the less likely they're here. Also, Los Angeles is different than DC, and they're both different from Minnesota. Minnesota seems to be more Oromo population dominant than other places, but you'll find everyone there. DC seems to be home to some of the oldest immigrants, but also some of the newest immigrants. In general, LA has some of the oldest immigrants to have been, capable of getting out here in the 60s and 70s, but there are some newer immigrants as well.
Yeah, LA has been an interesting case study, I think, because, well, for you especially, you're one of the few who I would call an expert on Aksum LA, and there's probably a lot to talk. We could probably do our own podcast just on Aksum LA. And if you're interested in Aksum LA, go ahead and listen to Henok's podcast because there's a lot of Los Angeles in there. Is there any sort of special or unique Ethiopian or Eritrean, right, Aksum history to Los Angeles that most folks don't know about?
Well, it's hard to say anything unique, but pretty much the people who saw signs of the regime following in the 70s, some signs of which were there in the 60s because there was a coup attempt in 1960. Those elites used to have a strategy where they go get educated in the US and then they return. My parents' generation and the one, plus or minus 5 years are the group of people who came here to get their education and return, but then they saw havoc back home and ended up staying. So they began to form the first churches. And I've said before that the church is kind of the last vestige of old Ethiopia, the Orthodox Church, that is. And so the community began forming in Los Angeles, but before it had, its own, from Ethiopia, there were already Black Americans from America, what we'd call ADOS now, and then Caribbean Black Americans as well, who had been under the banner of Rastafarianism and various different Black nationalist movements, I think a lot of which started in New York, but were big in LA as well, and somehow had made a connection with the later Abuna Yisak, back then just Abba Mandefro, and through him and the patriarch Abuna Theophilos, they were able to establish church communities. And a lot of times those communities would be led by the same Black American community. There would be English speaking communities. And so in Los Angeles, we have, who's still alive with us, someone I got to speak to, Father Amda Hamilton, or Mouseion Hamilton, Pillar of Zion is his baptismal name. And
Mouseion.
yeah.
Why not?
So he's in his early 80s now, but he was a longtime priest, the first Ethiopian Orthodox priest in Los Angeles. And he himself has a very interesting heritage as someone whose family comes from Texas and Louisiana, from kind of Creole America. He told me his grandmother didn't speak English, she spoke Creole. Wow. And so he kind of spoke a little bit of both as a kid. And their family is one of the first families that moved to Los Angeles. And they were part of a Black Catholic community, but he got into, the drug life and other things, was incarcerated, but had this moment after reading, I think it's Claude Sumner, I might get the name wrong, but one of these philosophers talking about the philosophy of Ethiopia and of Aksum.
There we go.
Comes out, joins these, various Black nationalist movements, brings gang members and gang leaders together, along with, that are more from that area, along with Caribbean, Rastafarians, along with that burgeoning Ethiopian community. And for some 15 years or so, maybe 20 years, led this community of Aksumites in Los Angeles, mostly English speaking in the beginning, but as more and more immigrants came fleeing the Red Terror in Ethiopia, once that got off in the 70s and 80s, you see the population of those church communities changing and pushing out kind of the Black Americans and the Caribbeans, sadly. And some of those are still there, and some of their, disciples and students are still there in various forms at the two major churches, at least the Slauson Church on Slauson Ave that Nipsey Hussle later made famous, another Aksumite who I got to participate in his funerary service for, at the Eritrean Church Madhani Alam on Western in Manchester, which is another part of South LA. My own church is on, it used to be on Compton and 46, with people used to confuse for the city of Compton, which it is not. Just kind of generic southeastern part of South Central Los Angeles. And then we moved to Main and 49th, or Main and 50th, between those two. So those are kind of those church sites. And there are a few other churches now. There's one, I think, on Normandy and 46th. There's another one in Inglewood on, I think, 99th and Inglewood, something like that, very close to Century Boulevard, right next to the airport. So these churches, I would say, and then Little Ethiopia, obviously, on Fairfax and Olympic, but also kind of unofficial Little Ethiopias in Mid-City, in West Adams, and in Inglewood, make up the kind of centers of Aksum in Ethiopia, little markets and liquor stores that are owned by Habeshas, as well as restaurants.
I think your description of LA, like, number one, it's a fantastic summary rather than like one event. You've kind of put it all into, a couple minute abstract. But what I noticed about it, and, our podcast was about, it ended up being about this, but Ethiopians of a unity and diversity, or some kind of plurality, defining, this Axumite culture and heritage. And what we saw in LA, right, that's Aksum. That's bringing people in who may be of different socioeconomic status and sociolinguistic groups, and they come together and they disperse, and like that's a recurring theme of Aksum. And I think Aksum LA, like, you are the king of Aksum LA, if there is one. So now that the throne is open or vacant. So anyway, I want to thank you for joining me today. If you have any final plugs, website, Substack, podcast, to the 3 or 4 listeners out there, there's probably 4 by the end of this episode. Definitely check out Henok's podcast. Go ahead and let us know where to find you.
Yeah, the easy thing you can do, you can type in Dr. Michael Wingert, Poaas, and you should find 2 episodes with Dr. Michael Wingert, and you'll find my podcast via that's the Philosophy of Art and Science, but the acronym is Poaas. Punch that into YouTube. I'm sure you'll find it, especially with his name, and you'll have 2 more episodes to watch as well. Then I'll just keep it simple and say head over to the Substack so you could read if you're a reader and not allergic to reading. That's Aksum, Aksum.substack.com. And thank you for having me. Amasaganalo, እግዚአብሔር ይስጥልኝ, እግዚአብሔር ይሁበከ፣ shukran, toda.
Lo medem aloha mbarech luch. And we'll next time, we'll meet again on this podcast, but we're also going to meet again on yours. So look for us on both, all 3 or 4 of you. All right.
I mean,
all right. Take care, my brother.